Hello there, and welcome back to The Price of Pain. Today's guest is Dr. Chris McCurdy. This is the second time he's been on the podcast. Those of you that have listened for a while, he ran through an introduction of who he is and in his research back in episode 8, with the promise that we would have him back on to talk more in depth about kratom, or as we call it in this episode, kratom, trying to harken back a little bit more to the origins of the word in Southeast Asia. And we set a record in doing so. In inviting him back, he became the first guest that's come on the show twice. And then in this episode, he set another record. If you'll notice the timestamp on this, this is a longer episode. It's about an hour and 15 minutes. We try to keep them less than an hour just to make it easier for you to listen to. But this was fun. And there was so much good information. And his passion for his work was very tangible. And it was easy to start talking about some of the recent developments with the World Health Organization, which we start with. In between these two episodes, the WHO had a panel of experts and lay people on, even mentions a Buddhist monk, to get their perspective on kratom and whether it should be regulated. We talk a little bit about history of kratom and what it is, and then what we've seen in the United States with recreational and medicinal usage of kratom, and then finish with some questions from you, which we've been waiting for so long. So a big thanks to everybody who submitted questions. Because we ran so long, we weren't able to get to all of them, but I think that was a nice way to wrap up this episode as long as it was. And because of that, I don't want to take any longer with this introduction, so let's get right to it.
Welcome to The Price of Pain, brought to you by the Pain Research and Intervention Center of Excellence at the University of Florida. Let's join host Dr. Joshua Crow in conversations with scientists, healthcare providers, and industry professionals as we delve into the highly subjective experience of pain and the ongoing effort to reveal its influence on our everyday lives.
Kratom has been the common pronunciation in the United States. So why that came about, I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
Because even in Malaysia, it's kratom, so it's a different pronunciation. But there's nowhere is there the cray.
Yeah.
Except for here.
Well, that's kind of how Americans do stuff with borrowed words, right? We have to say it our way.
And so I always say tomato, tomato, whatever it is. We all know what we're talking about.
Right,
so
right.
It really doesn't make much difference.
Yeah. So I was hoping that we could just narrow in on that a little bit more. And what was really exciting to me is the last time you came on, you were looking forward to the WHO, the World Health Organization, meeting to specifically discuss possible regulation and whatnot following. I'm gonna try to go with the new one and honor the root, and we'll call it kratom. But the regulation of kratom, and so I'm curious. Since then, what's developed?
So yeah, interestingly, so we had to get up at 3-something in the morning Eastern Standard Time to get on a Zoom call, and it was really interesting, and it actually beat flying over to Geneva, although I wouldn't have minded that trip. But getting online, there ended up being 10 individuals that addressed the WHO Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, or ECDD, and those individuals ranged from a Buddhist monk all the way through scientists like myself, some policy individuals, some people in the sort of dietary supplement industry as well. And so there was a good range of individuals. I'd say the majority were science background individuals, and they gave us each 5 minutes. So they essentially turned on your ability to share your screen, and then if you weren't done at 5 minutes, they promptly shut you off. But I was able to, knowing that ahead of time, I prepared a statement and actually got through my statement faster than I thought I would, and was able to share some of the latest science, threw up some PowerPoint slides and really showed them where directions were going, and that there is really some medical potential that we're seeing and the science is bearing out. And it's not just our work. It's a lot of groups that are that are working in this area. So that experience was really interesting. And then they essentially ended that open forum session. All of the members of the expert committee on drug dependence were in attendance virtually as well. There was just the secretariat's office and a couple of people at a table with a big WHO emblem behind them. And then basically silence.
Wow.
So we didn't hear anything for quite some time. And just last week or the week before last, the announcement came. The official word from the WHO came that they did not see any need to do a deep dive, full investigation into kratom. That they believe it would result in continued monitoring, continued surveillance at their sort of low level of surveillance, just to pay attention and see if anything strange happened. The reasoning behind this was, one, that it is a ethnobotanical or traditional medicine that's being used in parts of the world, and they didn't want to ban that ability. And then the second thing was the emerging science that's coming out. A lot of that coming from the work that we're doing here at the University of Florida. A lot of that also from work that's being done at the University of Science Malaysia. Work that's being done at Washington University in St. Louis, work that's being done at Columbia University, and other universities around. Many people are getting involved in trying to understand the science.
So that indicates that the usage of kratom is worldwide and multicultural, right?
That's right. And in fact, I was very impressed that the Buddhist monk that I referred to came on and spoke about how Buddhism endorses the use of cannabis and kratom, and said that, within their practice and when their beliefs, that if it can heal and benefit people, then it should be something that isn't blocked access to.
Wow.
And so it was really fascinating to hear, and in a sense have connected on LinkedIn with this monk, and now there's been some conversations go back and forth there. Just some mutual appreciation of, thanks for saying what you said, thanks for doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
But yeah, the science has really, I think, started to uncover some real medical potential here, and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater at this point. Let's see what comes up.
And so that was the purpose of this meeting, is to get expert opinion and have everybody plead their case for kratom, and then the WHO was going to decide whether they were going to jump in and begin regulating. Was that the purpose?
So the whole purpose was exactly that, and the WHO had essentially, they could do 4 different outcomes.
Okay.
One is, let's forget about this completely. We don't need to pay attention to it. They were already monitoring it on a global scale, just sort of that we're aware of this. We're aware that there's some potential health concerns in terms of risk or harm. And of course, they want to be protective of the global population if there is a legitimacy to that. The third thing they could do, which is what they chose to do, the second thing, they decided to just keep it at that surveillance level. The third thing they could have chose to do was initiate a full investigation. And so from that report's date, they would then meet again the next year. And during that year, they would do a deep dive into all the science, all the harm, all the adverse event reporting, just everything that they could gather to then make a decision whether or not that this substance should be put onto the banned list.
If they go that route, sorry to interrupt there, if they go that route, would they consider any new science? Would any studies be conducted specifically to look at concerns that they had.
So they could ask for more science. I think that that's sort of what they did this time. I think they sort of just said, look, there's not enough evidence to have us do a full investigation on this and consider a ban. So just keep doing what you're doing, science people.
Keep sciencing.
and let us see what comes out of it. So I think that's kind of what their decision was. The final decision they could have made was to absolutely internationally ban it immediately, which I didn't think would be an outcome. I honestly didn't think a full deep dive investigation was going to be an outcome either. And the outcome that came out, which seemed shocking to a lot of folks, and the American Kratom Association felt it was kind of shocking to them as well, because rightfully so, they believe there's been a lot of forces, external forces, really pushing to get a ban on this. Where all those external forces are, I can't really specifically say, and I don't want to throw any names out, but
sure.
But
if I may speculate, I'm curious, because when things come along like that, right? Well, first of all, I have two questions about that just outright worldwide ban, because that just doesn't enter my sphere. And one of the things that's most interesting to me about you interacting with the WHO is just the WHO in general, not even on the radar of the lay person until the COVID era. Right. And now, there's a fair amount of skeptics out there and criticism of the WHO, and some deserved. I mean, the WHO has admitted that, but knowing how that works, if the WHO says there's an international ban on this, is it still up to governments from countries around the world to decide whether they're going to adhere to that, or how does that work?
It would be up to those countries to enforce it,
okay.
Right? So the WHO doesn't have, as far as I know, doesn't have agents going around the world.
Right.
We don't see crime scenes with WHO on the back of the shirt. So, I think it would be left up to the DEA to make a decision in the United States if they're definitely going to put it into Schedule I of our Controlled Substances Act, which would mean there is no medical purpose, right?
Right. Well, and then the other thing before you go on, and I hope I don't cause you to lose track of your thoughts, but I wanted to jump in before that we go too far beyond it. It does seem, and I understand, your sensitivity to not wanting to call out, groups or individuals or whatnot, and I respect that. But it seems to me that oftentimes when there's pressure on regulatory bodies, particularly with pharmacological agents of any kind, oftentimes that comes from religious organizations or religious bodies. So I think it's very interesting that in this case, at least one religion, being Buddhism, as you mentioned, the monkeys there, is in favor or in support of this because of how interwoven it is into culture in a large part of the world.
Yeah, and really, I didn't have any indication of what this individual was going to say, although we had an agenda of who was speaking. And so for the most part, I looked over the names. I knew most of the scientists, of course, and knew that they were more than likely going to speak towards the medical benefits.
Right.
But I had no idea what some of these other individuals were gonna say, and quite frankly, the Buddhist monk was the first one to speak, and so when it sort of set that Zen tone, if you will, to kind of just
mellowed everybody out.
Okay, everybody can relax. But yeah, it was interesting to see. I mean, I don't think there's any huge surprise that would be in tune with Buddhist thought process of, if it's there for benefit, then it should be there for everyone to help human suffering or relieve human suffering.
Certainly makes sense.
Yeah.
At least to me. I know when people say that, oftentimes when people say that to me, well, it makes perfect sense. Half the time it does, half the time it doesn't. But from my perspective, that's I can appreciate that outlook. Also, I would have to ask and let's maybe start with your statement. But But it seems to be an advisory board that you were a part of, or an
Right.
advisory council that you were a part of that gave a perspective on this to the WHO. When you prepared your statement, did you pose both positive and negative effects
Oh, yes.
of kratom?
Yes. Yes.
And were there? I would assume that was probably, at least amongst the scientific community, that was par for the course. That was the norm. Is that fair to say?
And I think as scientists, we need to be really discussing what the results of our studies are, whether they turn out to be in favor or against. The data is the data. We have to explain that data, interpret that data properly, because at the end of the day, we're here to find out, is this a safe and efficacious, therapy or possibility for whatever the ailment that we would be pursuing, or is there harm? And if there is harm, is it occurring in certain situations?
Right.
So are there certain individuals that may be more prone to having problems because of their genetic makeup or metabolism? Or big question, what about pregnancy?
Right.
Can this be utilized during pregnancy? So various scenarios that we need to research and understand and really be able to put that information out there. Yes, there has been harm associated, particularly in the United States, with the use of kratom. Is it because people are trying to legitimately utilize it for a medical purpose, or is it because people are out there like trying to binge drink and do other crazy things? And that's where the bad rap comes from, because what happens, those are the ones that end up in the emergency rooms or poison control centers. That's where the press, that's where the medical community starts to learn about it.
This is why we can't have nice things. Right?
This is right.
And I do want to zero in on that in a little bit once we get past the WHO meeting, because that's still fascinating. And you brought up an important point that I hear pretty regularly, and not so much within the scientific community, but in a counterbalance to that, out in the public and in discussing with friends and family, various topics. We seem to be hardwired to want kratom is good, kratom is, fill in the blank, whatever's, we're very binary, right? It's either it's a good or it's bad. We should do it, we shouldn't. And in reality, there are very few things that really work that way. And so I think it's really interesting that, that there were some non-scientific individuals in this meeting to at least, voice a different perspective. And I do want to talk about them in just a moment. But also, I really like, this is the second time now, your symphony analogy that you used last time. Yeah. Fantastic. And I've gotten a lot of feedback on that from our listeners also about they love that. And I'm on board with it too. But the other thing you said is it's our role to, or our obligation even, to interpretate the data, or edit that out, please. Interpret the data, and not to not make inferences, but limited inferences, to what that may mean. But there seems to be a very important handoff of the baton. This is the evidence. These are the data. This is the evidence, and then a line is drawn where making of policy is somebody else's responsibility, and it's their obligation to take the input from you. So, having said all that, that was my monologue for a moment. Of that group, did anybody, and I don't mean by name specifically, but maybe by topic, did anybody lean more toward the negative in their perspective or their data, or even the non-scientists as well?
No, it was overwhelmingly supportive of continued research, pushing more boundaries of the science, understanding more, because all the scientists that spoke presented data that clearly show some potential benefits, and albeit in animals. And that's the controlled science we have now. Clinical trials are going to be coming out soon, and publications will be coming from some of those, I would say, in the early part of 2022. So it's going to be really interesting and exciting to start seeing at least, what's the safety like? What's the understanding that we can now have in a control situation in humans. But yeah, it's the majority of everyone that spoke from whatever sector they were was pushing the potential benefits and recognizing that there's been issues and recognizing that there's been harm. But for the most part, it's been, considering the global usage, the amount of harm has been relatively small. Now, if you're an individual or a family of an individual that was harmed or had a fatality involved, that changes your perspective, because that then it becomes a very different story. But I pulling back and looking at it in a larger, say 30,000 foot level, we definitely have a fairly decent safety profile when it is used properly.
Right.
And that's what we see from humans. So we'll see what happens as we are getting into more controlled clinical trials and we get to understand exactly what's happening. But yeah, I think.
Well, and it's hard. It's hard to comment on, because, okay, so let me take a step back. If I could just fill in the blanks a little bit on what you just said. What's important is, if the substance is used properly, and that's a somewhat subjective term, but if it's used properly, then what's the risk, right? I mean, you can take pretty much anything and get too much of it,
Sure.
Everything in moderation, including moderation. But but it's without clinical trials, it's hard to figure out what is the proper dosage and what is. So if you don't have those data, then you can't determine, well, these adverse events or these maladies or tragedies even come about because they're using this beyond what's suggested, because you don't have a suggested amount, right?
And we don't. And at the moment in time, the only thing that we can base dosing and safety on is by asking people what they use. And that's, most people are not always going to be upfront, forthright, and honest with you. In fact, when I was in pharmacy school and we were doing patient intake and we would ask them how much they smoke, if they smoke, and how much they drank, if they drank, they always told us double it.
Yeah.
Just assume it's going to be more than what they tell you.
Yeah.
And those all have significant impact on anesthesia levels. If you're going into a surgery, if you're not accurate about how much you drink, then they're going to have to push that anesthetic up higher than what you need, and that we could get into all those studies, but you know that well.
Yeah. Well, and I'm ashamed to admit, but the reason why I know that is I don't do clinical work. I'm not a clinician.
Right.
But man, I sure did watch House for a long time, and everybody lies. And when somebody came in and they had, there's an emergency and they coded or something and they had to be treated, anytime there's any kind of intervention, anesthesia or pharmacologic intervention, and it seems like they're not honest, then really bad things happen after that, because there are interactions that are unaccounted for.
Yeah, and I think it's been good because I've been able to develop some relationships with kratom users, and really understand, because I really want to honestly know how much do you use, how often do you use it, what do you feel like, do you titrate your dose like we do with a cup of coffee in the morning? I think we talked about it last time. Sometimes, 1 cup of coffee is enough for me in the morning. Sometimes I may not even need a cup of coffee, but sometimes I need 3 or 4. And it's like, how do you do that with a natural product that could have varying levels of compounds within it from batch to batch? And this is another big discussion that we're talking about now. Even if we were to come out and say, here are some standards, here are some suggestions we have around this product and its use, the variability in the natural product becomes huge. So do we set alkaloid limits or ranges where it's going to be, safe, and is it going to be efficacious if it's between X and Y, but it'll be toxic if it goes to Z, right? So
do we understand kratom and the compounds that are contained therein enough to understand the variability? Because an analog that comes up to me is cannabis,
Yeah.
right? There are different strains of cannabis, some more potent than others, but we're getting a better understanding of the compounds and the terpenes and all that. So you can say, okay, well, we're going to look, and this is your realm, not mine. So when we say we're going to look, but yeah, so we can say there's X amount of this, and as long as it's within this range, then this is pretty normal, and we know how it will affect you. Are we at that level with kratom?
I don't think so. We and I say we in the larger sense of kratom researchers, we know that the focus or the spotlight has been on mitragynine or mitragynine. Again, another compound we could discuss the pronunciation.
I have a question about that actually later. Yeah.
And so I say, and most of the individuals I know in the science side are saying mitragynine because the plant is Mitragyna speciosa. Mm-hmm. So mitragynine seems like a logical naming. So what we're doing, and most individuals are focusing on that. There was a study that came out by Dr. Shellard many years ago, decades ago, that indicated the relative abundance of alkaloids within the alkaloidal fraction that was extracted out of leaf material. Mm-hmm. They did that based on 3 trees. And so that set the standard for the way that kratom's alkaloids should be spread. Mm-hmm. We've been very fortunate because we work with some scientists in the Institute for Food and Agricultural Sciences here at UF, and we've been able to start looking at some plants as they are growing and looking at their alkaloid compositions. Not only that, we've actually had harvests of trees in Malaysia where we GPS identified those trees. We selected leaves from those trees, and we specifically analyzed content in those trees from the same local farm, and we found huge variation in alkaloid concentration.
Just within those trees in that space.
Right.
So that's not even really accounting for trees that grow in different regions, altitudes, climates, etc.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so what happens is that grower will harvest, and I'm speaking in Malaysia, in where I saw this happen. That grower will harvest their materials freshly. They will provide that same day that fresh harvested material to a for lack of a better word, retailer. Okay. But that individual will get the leaves and then brew the leaves as a tea and prepare them. And so it's a combination of all these trees that are made into what they call juice, but it's a tea essentially. So there's this whole discussion of strains where you have a red vein, green vein, white vein, different varietals. Kratom from see there I go kratom.
When you say veins, you mean in the leaves?
In the leaf, yeah. And so there's all these supposed strain differences, and there's location differences, and most of it to us is marketing. We have seen white and green vein, which are essentially the same. We've seen them on trees coexisting with red vein leaves, and so
on the same tree,
including different morphology of leaf shape on the same tree. So there's a toothed leaf and there's a sort of smooth leaf. Those are another 2 types that are talked about, and we've seen those on the same trees as well. And so you can see trees with more toothed leaves or less toothed leaves, but you can also see them coexisting in pretty similar amounts. It's fascinating, and I guess what I'm saying is we don't understand it, and I would equate it very much to cannabis. And we know that there's cannabis sativa strains that produce little to no THC or produce tremendous amounts of THC, at least compared to what used to exist 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
And so we're seeing that same pattern in the trees where we have some trees that produce very high amounts of mitragynine and other trees that produce almost none.
Hmm.
And so our interest right now is really understanding and taking those products, which all the products in the Western hemisphere, Western world, are purchasing and packaging based on mitragynine content being the major compound in there.
Right.
We've done a lot of studies, and a lot of other groups have done studies on that purified alkaloid to understand what it does and what its pharmacological properties are. Again, taking that symphony analogy, and we're really hammering on that supposed loudest instrument in the band already.
Right.
But there's still all the other things in there, and we haven't been able to catch up because it's harder to isolate those and pull those out.
Yeah.
But now we have other trees that have less, and so now we can start looking at these trees that people are saying are beneficial, and they still get the same effect, and they're shocked to find out that they don't have mitragynine, the major compound in it.
Right.
So
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and our grant, just to kind of wrap this part of it up, one of our grants is to specifically pull out each of those alkaloids that we see achieving plasma concentrations after the whole product is administered, and then recombine those after they're purified and start to look at the sort of purified cocktail, and then start removing one alkaloid at a time, and starting to see what the behaviors are, what the contributions are.
And when you say plasma concentrations, you mean in the blood?
Yeah, in the blood.
Okay.
And so not in humans,
Right.
but we're doing this in mice and rats, and then we can utilize those same species to look at the behaviors associated with those same combinations. And then from there, hopefully we'll be able to start understanding that exact composition. What are the limits? Where do we need to be compared to some traditional leaf products that are there? And by no means are we trying to create some artificial kratom formulation. What we're trying to do is really understand the science and say, okay, we're setting this. This is where the limits need to be, so you can get the efficacy that you want to see.
Well, and that's a testament to not only science, but I'd pat the WHO on the back as well, because looking at cannabis as an analog, that's not what happened with cannabis. It was there was at least in my understanding, a pretty gross, not only misunderstanding, but then intentional misconception or conceptualization of what cannabis is and what it does and how it's used. And in a way, it was almost weaponized. And there are some people listening along that would say, well, not in a way. It most certainly was weaponized.
Yeah.
And now we're finally circling back to a better understanding of not only the interactions of the compounds within the plant itself, but doing what you're talking about with kratom and paying a little bit more attention to people who have used it with a very specific purpose that's not recreational. So it sounds like the WHO, by saying, no, you know what, we'll keep watching, keep sciencing, do your thing, and learn more. That seems to me, at least, again, the right way to go about it. I think making decisions from a position of ignorance is usually not a good plan.
Hasn't been a wise choice in the past. So
speaking of the past, that's a good segue. I wanted to let you finish, and I'm sitting on the edge of my chair for a lot of this, but it does occur to me that there are people who are listening that have no idea what kratom is. And by the time they hear this part of the podcast, I will have already, finished this interview and recorded a nice intro to kind of give people an idea of what we're talking about. But I'd like to hear from you, the expert. Let's do a little bit of a prequel, an origin story. And if you can, we'll talk a little bit about kratom, the plant, and what parts of the plant are used. And maybe work that up to, before we get to some of these questions, work that up to the present day. Let's talk about what it is, how it's used, the cultures and how it's used in other parts of the world. And then when it began to, I don't want to say infiltrate because that gives a negative connotation, but when did we start seeing more usage in the United States and how is it used here? So let's go all the way back to the beginning and really catch people up on what kratom is.
Yeah, so let me start by saying that a lot of the a lot of the ammunition that was used to try and go after initial bans or impacts on kratom use was the fact that it was outlawed in Thailand and Malaysia, which is where it's from originally. So if you look on a map and you find Thailand and you follow it down to where the border meets Malaysia, and it's peninsular Malaysia at that point, that border region is supposedly ground zero of where this tree originated from, and that's a belief based on a lot of genetic work that's been done in the plant world on that side of things that I'm not as much of a I wouldn't even say a novice in.
Right.
However, in that region, it's a very rural region, which you would imagine, and there's a lot of laborers, farmers in that area that work from sun up till sundown. It's not a wealthy portion of either Thailand or Malaysia. And these laborers, mostly males, would chew the leaves. So they would pick the leaves from the trees, chew those leaves, very much like we heard about cocaine use, the coca plant use early on. And it would give a stimulant effect, and it would give them the ability to work harder, longer hours in that hot, humid, tropical, near the equator zone, and extend their time. And so there's old manuscripts on the effects of the kratom leaf chewers.
And so when and again, I understand that some of this is important to your work now, and so you're not a historian per se. So if you don't know these things, but I'm curious. So with how long ago, you had alluded to this in the last episode you were on, but how long ago, or what are some of the earliest traces of these people's using this?
So I don't know the earliest traces of use, but it's been centuries at least. I mean, I don't know if we can go to millennials, but it's at least been utilized for centuries in this traditional sort of setting environment. They would also, instead of chewing the leaves, they would also pluck the leaves and brew teas, as we earlier discussed. And if they go to consuming a bit more tea, they could get to a more sedative, relaxed effect. So they would maybe chew leaves or take a little bit of juice in the morning. Then they would do that again in the afternoon to get through the rest of the day. And then in the evening, they might consume a little bit heavier amount to kind of calm down from the day. This was the way that it was used, and the outlaw ban in Thailand happened in the 1940s when it became illegal, and they ordered destruction of all these trees.
Oh wow, that's pretty extreme.
It was very extreme, and the reason, at least that I've been able to find by researching and understanding it, was because it was cutting into the opium tax revenue.
Earlier on, when I said that there are detractors of any of these things, that's the other side. There's a seemingly historically a religious component, and then the other side is the monetary component. And is this going to interfere? Can we regulate it and make money off it? Is it cutting into profits from something that we already use?
Yeah.
Et cetera?
So I mean, interestingly enough, that's what happened. So. First of all, ordering destruction of all the trees is sort of like ordering eradication of kudzu from the southern United States.
Right.
It's
not going to happen.
So the second thing is that ironically, just about a year ago now, the Thai government reversed their decision and legalized kratom production and marijuana production.
So it's been illegal since the 1940s.
That's right.
Until very recently.
Wow. And the Thai government was convinced, based on the science, based on the global usage, and the feeling that they have the superior original product in the world, let's turn this into an economical windfall for our people that can benefit from this. And so now there's companies starting out of Thailand looking at exportation. In fact, someone told me that they they walked by a vending machine in Thailand that had kratom tea in it. So,
Wow.
there's this going on, but that historical usage had always been within these sort of laborers, and as I said, it was male.
Mm-hmm.
Female usage of this was very taboo. It was considered not something for women to use at all. In fact, even to this day, if you interview females about, they know it,
Mm-hmm.
they know what it is, but very few, if any, will admit to using it.
Really? What drives that? Why is it unacceptable for women?
I don't know what the origins of that were, other than it's still a very, for lack of a better word, 1930s, 1940s
Mm-hmm.
type style of what we were used to in the United States, where the male works and brings home the money and the food, and the wife runs the shop, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that traditional culture is still that way there, and it's just viewed as a problem if the female is using this sort of material. So I don't know what the exact
So
stories
I'll tell
are.
you right now, there are plenty of people that are listening along right now that bristle at that idea.
Oh, and I
That
bristle.
double standard, yeah.
I
Yeah.
do too.
Yeah.
This is a real issue. More interestingly, I mean, we're starting to learn there are definite differences in exposure, in pharmacokinetics exposure between males and females. So many years ago, the National Institutes of Health required that we start to do studies very balanced, because all the studies used to be done in males.
Right.
And now, thankfully, we have equality in the research and the rigor of that research to really look at species differences and sex differences. And so we're seeing some sex differences. Funny enough, though, it's like in mice, the males get more, the females get less exposure. In rats, it's vice versa.
Oh, interesting.
And so we're not going to know until we get to actual
And
controlled human
when you
trials
say
what we
exposure,
see.
do you mean the bioavailability?
The bioavailability. So we look at when we give a drug or a natural product to an individual or an animal in this case, we're going to see how that individual animal or group of animals is experiencing that drug. So not only do we look at the pharmacology, which is what the drug does to that system, we look at what that system does to the drug, and that's called pharmacokinetics. And that allows us to understand what exposure of those chemicals are in the plasma, which is generally where we look, but we also do tissue distribution. We look at obviously the target for these alkaloids would be in the brain. We want to know, are they getting into the brain? And if they're getting into the brain, how much is there? So we look for a lot of those things. So yeah, when I speak about exposure, then we can quantify that by really looking at concentrations of compounds in the blood over time.
Yeah. Before we get back to the, I guess the pathway to kratom in the U.S., I thought of this before just because so much of my research and my research interests have a behavioral component. When you're conducting these rodent studies and you're analyzing blood, are you also looking at things like heart rate, respiration rate, balance, those types of measures that you look at behavioral impacts?
So we definitely always are looking at gross behavioral changes. So if the animals are hunkered down in the corner of the cage, that's not a good sign. They should be up, running around and acting normal, so to speak, for what that animal species should be displaying. So we do a gross behavioral all the time, but we will get into a lot of specifics. So we'll look at coordination, we'll look at blood pressure, temperature, weight of the animal over time, especially if we're giving multiple doses. Is this affecting their eating? So we always try and take a lot of those things into consideration. And if we notice something abnormal, then we'll try and design studies specifically to target, okay, we're seeing weight loss over a week period, and these animals are growing and supposed to be putting on weight. What's going on?
Yeah. And then you can look also, circling back to dosage. Does this happen at so many units per deciliter or however it's
Correct.
measured in rodents and whatnot?
Exactly.
At what point do you start to see the onset of those effects?
Exactly. And so let's drift back to
Let's get
that
it.
traditional use,
Yeah.
right? So that traditional use was going on for quite some time, and I think it becomes very very circular in a little while. So that traditional use started to get picked up on in the United States, I think around the time the opioid crisis really started to take hold in many places. And that is because one of the other traditional uses, I talked about how it improved the ability to work out in those conditions. However, a lot of those guys were using opium. And I'm not talking about prescription opiates. I'm talking about the real deal opium product from the opium poppy, that milky exudate. And so they would utilize that. If they ran out of opium, they utilized kratom so they wouldn't go into withdrawals.
Oh.
And this was something that was caught on and thought to be really interesting.
May I ask really quickly, because if I'm understanding you correctly, at certain dosages, kratom functions as a stimulant. You said they're able to get through the day, but at the same time, you can, whether it's by making a tea or whatnot, at different dosages, it's more of a sedative and it relaxes people. You said in the evenings. So how is it? Do I have that part right?
Yeah, that's
okay,
right.
Okay. I'm just thinking, man, if coffee could do that, like if I could just put in a different brew and have a cup of coffee to settle down at night.
Yeah, well, the ones that are infused with marijuana now, I think, can...
That would probably do it.
So,
yeah, I'll keep looking at Publix for those.
Or you get the Irish coffee, right?
Yeah,
So,
right. Well, that I can make. Yeah, that adds some
so
experience.
there's those aspects.
But yeah, so when you're talking about mitigating withdrawal symptoms from opium and smoking opium in this case, or
so I'm not sure exactly how these individuals were ingesting the opium,
but anyway, mitigating the withdrawal symptoms if they're coming off of opium, are they using small doses of kratom to offset that as a stimulant, or larger doses to mimic some of the effects of opium?
I'm not sure exactly how this was discovered, learned, or the practice began, but it was definitely documented in some of the very first documentations from Westerners that came in to find out about this medication and what its uses were, and this was one of the documented uses. So then there was also individuals that wanted to get off of opium and stop using opium because of the cost, or because it was harmful, or because of other concerns. And they found out that they could just switch over and use kratom and not go into any withdrawal. And it's, of course, abundant. Almost every home you go to in this area of the world has a kratom tree growing in its yard. And so it's a very, very indigenous part of society there, and that got us interested. I mean, first thing that when I came across the plant for the first time, I was asked by the National Institute on Drug Abuse to look into a presentation for analgesic plants.
Okay.
And so I went through all the literature, found Mitragynous speciosa that really hadn't been touched on much. And so we started trying to see if we could find it. And sure enough, there was websites back in 2004, 2005 that were selling the botanical in the U.S. At that point in time, though, it was really obscure. Not many people knew about it. Even today, not a lot of people that I run into know about it.
Yeah.
But then it was for sure not known. The DEA had nothing on their radar. Of course, the FDA, nothing. And it was not even really being paid attention to. We brought it in. We were hearing individuals were doing the same thing in the United States with leaf material that was imported. So there's one huge difference, right? Everything that I talked about in traditional use was with freshly harvested leaf off the tree, or freshly harvested leaf that was made into tea. now we're talking about leaf that's making the transportation literally halfway around the world, probably on container ships because they didn't want to spend a lot of money. So it's being exposed to elements, heat, sunlight, whatever it is. And then that product arrives in the U.S., and then people are starting to make teas from those leaf materials. And in the beginning, that's really what was going on. I think people were really looking for a legitimate alternative, way to treat their pain, alternative way to get off of opiates, mood elevation. And that's the majority of, if you interview individuals today, that's still the majority of what the use is in the U.S.
And is it in the U.S. the cultural origins of being a male only things that reflected here? Or do you see pretty even amounts?
No, it's pretty much not an issue here.
So you can get more anecdotal evidence at this point, at least from females who use this as well. I was just curious.
That's right. No, that's right. And we again, as the whole Society of Kratom Researchers, because I'm not epidemiologist or one that goes out and asks questionnaires in the community, but we try to keep those balanced in terms of male and female respondents and what we infer from that, and then we can also look at that separately. But in the U.S., this is where we're at. The plant material started coming in. It started to get a cult following, a lot of sort of under the radar following, people saying, yeah, this works, and people then offering like, oh, you have this problem, try this, try that. All of a sudden, then we start seeing it to appear in gas stations, a lot of times next to the stimulants that were there. Like you would see stackers, and then you would see something like, what the heck is this? And the guys behind the counter at the gas stations are like, hey, try this one.
Yeah. 5-hour energy, ginger root, kratom.
And sadly, I think that's where also some of the problems started with the harm, because many of the products that were out there, and some are still out there, had very suggestive names as to what effects you would get from that, right? And so I won't throw anybody under the bus again, but I'm just saying, marketing has a lot to do with who's going to end up purchasing those products. And a lot of the states that have made things illegal, or the states that have restricted sales, have now restricted it so that anyone under 18 shouldn't be buying these things or whatnot. Then we start to see more elegant products coming into the marketplace. So 5-hour energy, now we have kratom shots that have a mixture of kratom, blue lotus, other different types of botanicals within it. And again, they can't make any claims, but people are. And
are those like some of the other things where there's no FDA control over this at this point? So
there is some FDA regulation and control. However, there's not enough agents to enforce any of it, and so it becomes very, very much a wild, wild west, which is what I always say. So you end up getting product in the marketplace. You have some people that are legitimately out there really wanting to help people, really wanting to reduce suffering, and provide a product that would accomplish that. And then, just like in any free commerce, you have people that want to make a buck on the next big thing. We see it all over the place in CBD right now. I mean, there's
I was gonna point that out. So we have some stages here that we can look at in different paradigms that can inform some of the pitfalls in this process. And the first that I was going to ask, as far as FDA and whatnot, is just the exercise supplement industry.
Yeah,
right? You could buy something that claims to have X, Y, and Z in it, but it's a proprietary blend, so you don't know how much. You might think that you're taking that, and instead you're taking 3-day-old coffee grounds that have been steeped in hot dog water or something. You don't know.
You don't know.
And then a little bit of the, if you take that and move it into CBD, for example, which you were about to comment on, and we've seen this a little bit in preparations for our research as well. You have the the juxtaposition of federal regulation against what states are doing, and then controlled. And when I say controlled, I don't mean by law, but quality controlled versus what you might get from your friend down the street. And so you don't know how much of a compound is in a pill or a gummy or whatever the active ingredient is. There's not enough control and regulation to let you know what exactly you're taking.
Right.
And so combine those two things together, the not knowing, and then you have a fair segment of the population who kind of just doesn't care. And they say, oh, well, I'll try it. And so the headache that I'm seeing from your perspective, at least looking from the outside in, is you're trying to do these well-constructed studies and balance that with some anecdotal evidence from people who use this medicinally or recreationally. But that evidence is, I don't want to say take it with a grain of salt, but at the same time, you don't know exactly what they're taking because they might not know what they're taking, or at least in quantities.
Right.
So that's how they create a huge headache.
That's a big part of it. The other thing is estimates are anywhere from 2 to 15 million users in the United States, and I would tend to guess that it's closer to that higher number than it is the lower number. And then you do have this population that doesn't seem to care and just wants to try the next new thing, and let's push the boundaries of it. And unfortunately, that small segment of the user population is the one that ends up in the emergency room.
Right.
Because they've misused the substance. And like we said, you can misuse anything. You can drink too much water.
Yep.
You can die from drinking too much water. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but it happens.
You know what? I'm going to interject right now, just for people who are not locals to Gainesville won't understand this, but I used to deliver pizza, back in the 90s while I was in undergrad, and I was challenged to drink a gallon of water as fast as I think it was 10 minutes, drink a gallon of water in 10 minutes, which seems relatively easy. And I was, I think I was maybe 150, 160 pounds at the time, so there wasn't much of me. And I almost did it. And I'm disclaimer, don't do this. Don't try this at home, kids. But also shout out to 5-Star. Those are the good days. So anyhow, 5-Star pizza for the non-locals. So anyway, I did this. I attempted this. I failed, and there was vomiting.
Yeah.
But only after I attempted this, they said, "Oh well, could have been worse." This other guy that we bet to do this, we found him 3 blocks down the road, wandering in a state of confusion in the parking lot. He had driven to that parking lot. So, yeah. Anyway, anything in the wrong quantities can be toxic.
Go back to Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Everything in moderation,
That's right.
including moderation.
Including moderation.
So, I think these are really important things that we need to understand. And the other thing that we work really hard on and try to do, and maybe don't do so well, is educate the medical community. Because the medical community, and I'm speaking of nurses and physicians that are right there on the front lines and are going to see these people that are stupid and make the wrong choice and end up overdoing it. But those are what make it into the medical literature.
Yeah.
And those are the case studies that everybody, including the FDA, can pull back on and say, look, here's the harm that's happening. And CDC can get involved and say, this is harm. We need to do something about it. And that's the biggest headache that we have.
Right.
And so the immediate reaction from a physician that first learns about kratom by reading a journal of clinical toxicology or something like that is, oh, this is bad stuff. Boom, throw it away. And immediately they have now an implicit bias that says,
right.
If I see a patient on this stuff, they're up to no good.
Yeah.
And that's really not the case. And in fact, we've worked with the local hospitals here. We've talked with physicians at Shands Hospital, the local hospital here in Gainesville, at UF, and really tried to change the intake questionnaires that are done, because they don't ask if people take alternative natural products or dietary supplements or herbal supplements or anything like that. But it could be a key to understanding why they're not responding well to certain medications, or why they're having certain effects while they're in the hospital because they're not getting that dietary supplement or herbal that they've been using. And so, really trying to understand the patient as a whole, not just what prescription medications or over-the-counter medications. We need to really understand what people are taking.
Yeah. Just in general, yeah.
And they're not going to tell you if they're taking kratom because it's got this sort of stigma.
Yeah, well. So before we run out of time, I do want to address some of these questions that Kat was able to collect by reaching out into the community, and in no specific order. So we danced around this earlier, and I almost asked then, but Oliver, could be LV or IV, from Reddit asked, can kratom cause long-term brain damage like other opiates?
So, first of all, we don't know. We have not done any long-term studies. Anecdotally, there's not really any evidence to suggest this either. However, we won't know until we do controlled trials. We have not done long-term exposures even in animals yet. We are very much interested in moving into those directions and looking what happens. I will say that related to that question, babies that are born to mothers that are using opiates generally will go through what's called neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, NOWS, or just opioid withdrawal syndrome. Those babies, depending on the exposure, depending on how much the mother had, and depending on the outcome of the baby's observational and treatment during that period, those babies generally tend to have more learning difficulties and more behavioral problems. We don't know if that's the case with babies that will be born to mothers with kratom, and we're actually doing studies along those lines right now with rats so that we can see if there is an impact, and then try and follow those pups that are born to see if they can behave like normal
like
pups.
You would expect them to. Yeah.
And so that that doesn't address the adult brain, but it certainly will help us understand if there is any impact on brain formation and learning and memory.
Yeah, a quick follow-up to that of my own. What have you observed with regard to clearance rate or half-life in rodent models of kratom? If you say you give them again, normal dose, or let's say a non-toxic dose that you would still see some behavioral effect from, how long does that last typically for them?
Yeah, it totally depends on the dose, because the dose will result in the exposure, and then the exposure results in how long that's going to last. So we generally see, and I'll bring this back anecdotally to humans, humans will utilize it 2 to 3 times a day, sometimes more, but generally 2 to 3 times a day. When we dose animals, we usually do a single dose, and that plasma half-life, or that exposure and clearance, can really sort of look at 4 to 8 hours after a dose. And so that comes in line with what could be 3 times a day. I mean, obviously there's difference between human and the way a rat metabolizes.
Sure.
But I think that's pretty standard.
And then, of course, the big question: have you observed any kind of addictive characteristics?
In animals, we have not done long-term studies to look at addictive or abusive behavior. What I can tell you is that in more acute studies, so we've done 7-day where we've given mice kratom tea for what we freeze dry it, so it's spaceman kratom tea. But we give it usually twice a day to these mice for 7 days. And then we look at precipitating withdrawal. So
Okay.
we actually inject them with Narcan or naloxone, and we look at their behaviors. And we can do this with morphine. This is well studied in the literature. You can habituate a mouse or a rat to morphine, then you can push them into a rapid detox withdrawal with naloxone. And when we do that as a control group, we have several behaviors that we can look at to see that withdrawal is definitely present. With kratom, we have not seen many withdrawal symptoms at all, or if we do, they're incredibly attenuated as what you would see with morphine, so much less.
Okay.
That's not to say that there isn't issues, and isn't certain individuals that may metabolize things differently that could lead them to having more euphoric experience, or more I wouldn't want to say addictive, but they could have a kratom use disorder more likely than someone that could just utilize it on a daily basis at the same dose. We have heard that there is, over time, individual kratom users, and I'm talking about humans now, will have to increase their dose. So there is some tolerance that seems to be there. But again, way less than what you see with traditional opioid or prescription opioid. That we have seen in animals as well. So we see a less tolerant development, and again, comparing back to opiates. But it does exist. It does happen. And I'm sure that if we studied this long enough and we push doses out long enough and high enough as that tolerance develops, we could probably precipitate more severe withdrawal in the animals. But in a subjective opioid withdrawal scale, the SALS scale that's used clinically, kratom has been reported in the literature to have a 9 value. So 9 in terms of, not a 9 in terms of a 1 out of 10, this is a 1 out of 30 range.
Okay.
And so 30 is the most severe. And then 30 down to, I believe it's 20 or 21, that defines severe withdrawal. 10 or 11 to 20 or 19, whatever it is mild or moderate withdrawal. Anything below 10 is considered mild withdrawal, and coffee falls within that range.
I was just going to ask. All right.
And so, again, let me be very clear. This is with very controlled. We know exactly what the makeup is of the alkaloid contents in there, and it's very close to the traditional usage that we see in Southeast Asia. So when it's being utilized in that way, in that form, we don't really see much problem there. And that's in our animals, and in the human studies, they were talking to individuals that were using it for the purposes of medical benefit, not for abuse, and not for euphoric feelings.
Now we have another question that I think, and maybe it's a question and a statement to throw in some of the anecdote here from comfortable-push 8046 from Reddit. So not quite a shove, just a comfortable push.
I like it.
Has kratom been found to boost the immune system? I've never been ill while ingesting kratom on a daily basis.
Yeah, so there's a lot of great anecdotal evidence out there for many ailments. Okay, one of those is the not getting ill. How that's happening, I'm not sure we know. So does it boost the immune system? I can't tell you if it does or it doesn't. But again, the anecdotal thing is, hey, yeah, this seems to work. When you speak to people in Malaysia, they will tell you that not only does it help them stay healthy, it does a number of things that may contribute to that. It decreases anxiety. So decreasing anxiety really helps benefit the overall body's wellness.
Absolutely.
Right? It'll decrease your pain experience. It'll decrease your likelihood of getting ill. So is it boosting the immune system because it's dropping anxiety levels? Don't know. Also seems to be very beneficial in controlling blood sugar, anecdotally. And so individuals with diabetes seem to be able to control their blood sugar better while they're using kratom. No clinical evidence of this at all, but something that we're very interested in understanding as well. Kratom has many, many compounds within its realm. So we've tried to study looking at intestinal makeup. So we hear about probiotics, and we hear about the ability for certain plants or certain bacteria, like you would find in yogurt and things like that can help with gut health. And so there's a huge brain-gut axis. We have some great researchers here looking at these things. And is there some sort of effect just from kratom itself traveling through the intestinal system that's regulating bacterial makeup in the gut? Is it normalizing things? Is it helping in that situation of diabetes? Is it helping in other situations that are decreasing inflammation? So there's so many things, and it sounds like sort of this holy grail panacea plant and some things that you might read or come across. And we have to be very, very careful, because the last thing in the world you want to do is try and oversell something that does sound like that, because then it starts to sound like we're out there peddling snake oil in the old days of back to that wild, wild west again.
But what is fantastic is, from a research standpoint, there are a lot of avenues of inquiry to really get a better understanding of this. And that kind of leads me into a question that I got. I got a number of questions from Josue via email. And he really was talking in a lot of these questions. We don't have time for all of them. As a matter of fact, we don't have time for very much more at all. It's a great conversation. But he seemed to ask a lot about cost-benefit ratio to kratom use. And I want to zero in on one of his questions specifically. Do you think that, and this is a projection based on what you know now, and obviously the broad disclaimer that I think that you've made pretty clear, but just to drive the point home, is that there's a lot that we, the scientific community, don't know. And so some of these comments, you've been really clear that you've seen evidence from, either in an animal model or in looking at even the blood plasma levels and plasma concentration. Some is anecdotal evidence, which is much less reliable, much less controlled. And then some you just don't know yet. So I just to make sure that everybody's on the right page here. But maybe just a projection. Do you think that kratom is more useful for acute pain, for example, in perioperative situations around surgery, or do you think it's more effective for chronic states? Do you think that there's a differentiation? So
based on what we're seeing in animals, and I can speak a little bit to this in animals, and we're not looking at post-surgical conditions or situations that would be that type of acute pain. We're looking at more blunt acute pain, so either thermal or chemical nociception, so where we actually inject acetic acid into an animal, or we put formic acid, which will induce an inflammatory response, or we put these animals into an environment where we dip their tail in 52 degrees centigrade water. They won't keep their tail in there very long, but if they're getting analgesic relief, they don't feel it. Or we put them on a hot plate, which is exactly what it sounds like, and we look at their ability to lick their paws or start moving around. That's a pain indicator. So in those situations, we don't see great efficacy for kratom. I mean, it works, but it works at the level of something like codeine or a nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug, which is consistent with literature that goes back to the 1970s. However, when we look at it in a more chronic pain context, we're starting to see really nice efficacy, comparable in some animal models to things like gabapentin or pregabalin, which are used for neuropathic pain treatments in humans. And so some of that work has been presented at meetings. It hasn't been published yet in peer-reviewed literature, but that's I think I can see kratom much more effective in more chronic pain states.
Okay. And then I want to finish with KS _ Brian, again from Reddit, but also from the Kratom Science podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so he cited a study by, and I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, it's either Berthold et al. 2021. It was published in Drug Metabolism and Disposition. He said, does this show that 7-hydroxymitragynine can only have a powerful opioid effect if it's somehow extracted first and consumed instead of produced solely by the metabolism of metragynine?
Yeah, that's our stance right now. That was a paper, Aaron Berthold, who's a graduate student in our group, fantastic graduate student. She conducted an experiment, and we've always wondered what is the consequence of our body's metabolism of mitragynine, the major alkaloid, to the 7-hydroxymitragynine, which we know has high abuse potential, very potent analgesic activity, comparable to prescription opiates. And we've seen that it has potential for addiction behavior on its own. But is it somehow mitigated by the presence of the greater quantity of mitragynine and other alkaloids that are in the plant? So we never knew how to answer that question. And we knew that products that we would purchase and analyze that had higher amounts of 7-hydroxymitragynine to start with would have more analgesic relief in the animals that we studied. But all the products that we've been testing lately, and maybe we've had some impact on the industry, is that we tell people 7-hydroxy should be below the limits of detection when you're purchasing material. And so we're starting to see that in the marketplace. We're starting to see those levels come down. These are in the higher end products that are paying for a lot more testing. But what we think is going on is that metabolism is of no consequence in terms of the activity. But I think it depends on how much you start with in the beginning. So if there's some present already in the product that one is ingesting, we don't know where the ratio or what I would call break point is. And it could be highly individual dependent. So there's an enzyme, a specific enzyme in the body that's converting mitragynine to 7-hydroxymitragynine. And we know from drug metabolism in general that you can have slow metabolizers, normal metabolizers, rapid metabolizers, and ultra rapid metabolizers. And so if we're into a situation where we have an ultra rapid metabolizer that can quickly and efficiently convert mitragynine to 7-hydroxymitragynine, that could be a problem from a individual genetic standpoint of view. And that's a hypothesis we don't know how to test. Thankfully, at the University of Florida, we have an incredible pharmacogenomics program and personalized medicine program that really can go in and interrogate humans' genetic makeup for their metabolizing enzymes. And we've talked with that group to say, hey, if we can identify what enzymes are doing these things, and we can get to a point of doing clinical trials, and there's a lot of ands, but could we start to look at this from a genetic perspective and say, hey, if you are an ultra-rapid metabolizer with this enzyme and this genetic makeup, you should probably think twice about taking kratom. So, I mean, we're really trying to get at it from this holistic perspective and understand it at that level.
How exciting to be working on something that there are still so many question marks and so much to be done. I'm envious of you. That's fascinating.
Thanks. It's a hell of a ride.
I'll bet.
It's so much fun.
So you were the first guest that you made a record. You're a record holder, at least for the podcast, and you're the first guest that we've had back on. And we scheduled that very quickly before you left the studio to begin with, and now I'm pretty sure that you are the record holder for the longest episode.
Sorry.
No, not at all. We try to keep these, right around 50 to 60 minutes, and
Yeah.
we've blown well past that, and I'm confident that we could talk for a lot longer. I'm sure that just about everybody is just as intrigued as I am and has been along for the ride this whole time. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you. Me too. You don't
And
realize how much time goes by.
I know, right? And well, it makes me think that maybe I'm doing my job right as well. But you know, for those who have tuned out, well, then they'll just move on to the next one, and it's their loss. But a most sincere thank you. Now, people won't hear this until the new year, so it's going to sound a little bit strange. But I wish you a happy holidays, and thank you so much for coming back on.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me here. You can tell there's a lot of passion behind the work that I do, and real love for the people that I get to work with. I get to go out and talk about it. There's an army of individuals that really are the ones that get the credit for what we do, and I can't thank them enough. But I will tell you, I obviously love to talk about it, and and would be happy to do it another time if that deems necessary.
Sounds good to me.
Thank you for joining this episode of The Price of Pain. Opinions expressed on this podcast are solely those of the host and guests, and not representative of the University of Florida or parent institutions of our guests, unless specifically stated. You can find more information about Price on the World Wide Web at price.ctsi.ufl.edu. And keep up with our researchers on social media by searching Facebook for UF Price, by following @UF_Pain on Twitter, and Price of Pain Podcast, all one word, on Instagram.